My name is Jennifer Reynolds. I was born and raised in Canada. I've been working in travel all of my long living life. I started working for a Canadian tour operator right before I was 20 years old and had a chance to work in the Dominican Republic and Mexico and a few other places before going out and spending a number of years on cruise ships. So it's pretty neat to have had almost 18 years at sea initially. I was part of a duo juggling magic act. Yeah, yeah, that was one story. But I did move over into the shore excursion department. I ran tours on ships for a really, really long time. And well, quite a while ago, I started considering myself, I think, to be a little bit more of a traveler than a tourist. And in the last year, I managed to accomplish three things. I call it the AAA. I went to Africa. I got over to Tanzania. It was a year ago in May I got there. I also went for Christmas to Australia. I do have some family in Tasmania, and maybe that's a topic we'll come back and visit at another time. I came to particularly love the island of Tasmania and what it has to offer. And then also within that same 1 year period, I had a chance to go to the Antarctic continent. And yes, it was my seventh continent. It was the final continent for me, and it was the journey of a lifetime. So I am so glad all of you are here tonight because I'm going to share this trip to the Antarctic with you, what it was like, why I chose to go, how I chose to go, what it's like to get there, what kind of options are available to you there. But there is no question, one of the first things that really appealed to me was the quote animals. Remember, I'd been to Africa last year and kind of thought I knew everything before I started looking into the Antarctic and realized that cetaceans and penguins were going to become my best friend. But you know, I had a girlfriend that had traveled down there. I'll introduce you to her in just a moment. But I wanted this experience. I wanted to see it and smell it and taste it and feel it. And my girlfriend Maureen, who I worked with in Miami for a long time, who now lives in Guatemala, started sending me really cool pictures like this because she went to the Antarctic. And I had gone down and visited with her in Guatemala, where she lives. And in fact, we had a date later this month, which we'll put off for a couple of months. And then girlfriend started sending me more Facebook posts, more pictures, more videos about the ship that she went on, the experience that she had. She went to 6633, which will mean something to you in a moment. And the day that this popped up on my Facebook, I said, you know what? I got to have this and I got to have it before the end of the year. And so I made the decision that I wanted to go to Antarctica, and I would do Antarctica, Australia, and Africa and bang them out in that 1 year period of time. But you know, my sound is going in and out, Jill. Tell me if that's sounding a bit better because I may be wiggling around in my seat and I've got a new headset. So thank you for that. But one of the first things I discovered is that I had a lot to learn geographically about the Antarctic. There was a bunch of ways that it could be done. I knew an awful lot less than I thought I did, and there were a number of ways to be able to get there. Now, I'll show you some statistics and stuff a little bit later on, but this map should become fairly familiar to you. And I'll show you the way I chose to come in, which was actually through Argentina. But when you're talking about the Antarctic is actually considered to be all land and ice shelves south of 60th parallel. And look at that map right there. Look south of the South America and a little bit north of where it says Falkland Islands, where you can see the tip of the peninsula sticking up, where that shows us the 60 degrees. Everything south of there is considered to be part of the Antarctic. And we are going to talk about the convergence. We'll talk about what it means to be in those particular areas, because you know what? It really does make a big difference. So when you're looking at going down to this part of the world, take a look at this map. We talked about rivers last night. And when you're looking at Antarctica, you kind of got to start to get to know your geography a little bit. I'm trusting that you can see my handy little highlighter here, but some stuff goes in and out of Ushuaia, not everything. There's some exceptions, and I'll show you some itineraries. But you've got the Antarctic Peninsula here, which is where the majority, about 97% of the travel goes to. November to March is when the season takes place. Drop down below it and you see the polar circle, 6633. Kind of a big deal. My girlfriend got down to 6633, which is the polar circle, and there's a lot of people that want to do the polar circle south, and they want to do the north as well. Southern end down towards the Ross Sea. The South Pole right in the center for the most intrepid of travelers. And then look over to South Georgia and the Falkland Islands. When you're starting to talk over this part of the ocean, you're going to have some choices to make. Do you want to include these islands? More sea days are going to be included. These are all factors that are going to come into play with what it is that you're doing. So bear these kinds of things in mind as we look a little bit further through the maps and the options that are kind of available. Once again, let's take a look at this map down here. It was 250 million years ago. We had that one planet that was called Pangaea. You're all familiar with plate tectonics, and that's one of the reasons why even here in Antarctica, there's fossilized remains of ferns and freshwater fish and all kinds of interesting places, even in a spot that is so incredibly remote. I want to make sure y'all can hear me all right. If there's anything up there, Michelle, if you can hear me, I'm getting a little thing that says I may be experiencing an audio. So let me just click on that, and audio says it's cutting in and out. So I'll count on you being able to hear, and I won't beat it up too badly. When you're looking at the Antarctic Peninsula, you're going to see things like Bellingshausen Sea and the Weddell Sea. And these two are going to come into play in some of the itineraries that you choose to want to look at. That polar front. That polar front makes a really big deal. I'm going to come back to that in a minute once we take off from Ushuaia and start going southbound towards the Antarctic itself. But essentially, that's the Antarctic convergence. And that's the piece of water where the cold water coming up from the Antarctic meets the warm water coming down from the northbound. And it's right along here then that you get a tremendous amount of rough water, and that's what makes the Drake Sea so difficult. But it's also something that is very generous in terms of stirring up plankton and all of that neat stuff that lives in the water, which is why the Antarctic is so very nutrient rich. So when you start looking at the Antarctic and you start looking about wanting to go here and choosing a way to get there, there's a variety of ways you can do it. Pretty much all of them are going to be by cruise ship. That's the only way. There's no hotels here. There's nobody that lives here in the Antarctic. You might have an itinerary that comes into Buenos Aires, gets down to Ushuaia, includes the Falkland Islands and South Georgia, over to South Shetland, and then maybe down into the peninsula. You'll find something nowadays where there are planes, charter aircraft that are leaving Punta Arenas in Chile, flying over the Drake Passage and arriving at a base there. There is an airport. It is not a commercial base, it's a charter. So if you don't want to have to sail over the Drake Passage, there are options nowadays where you can actually fly over it. Most of the itineraries, look in the upper left-hand side. You'll come out of Ushuaia, you'll have 11 days. You'll touch the South Shetland Islands and you'll start hanging out around the Antarctic Peninsula. That's a very, very common itinerary. You might want to add in the Falkland Islands or South Georgia, but to do that, you're going to start adding time. You're going to need 18, 19 days to do that. And we're going to look at the kinds of ships that travel down here in just a moment's time. But you got to start thinking about what exactly is it do you want out of your itinerary. This is the kind of stuff you can do down here now. You can go camping and kayaking, hiking and snowshoeing. Yeah, there's even some companies that are doing extreme stuff with scuba diving and snorkeling. You can charter a small sailboat and even go down here. I stayed pretty traditional in the kind of experience that I wanted to have in the Antarctic. And remember, this goes back to sort of the 80s, kind of the 90s type of thing, when it was the Russian ships, the Russian icebreakers that were going down here. You could buy a berth, you could bring your kids along, 4 people to a room, and you could basically hook up with some ships that were doing research. And that's kind of how the whole thing started down here. And it wasn't that long ago, in the 90s, maybe, even over into 2000. And I have statistics for you later on the number of travelers that are here. Then go above that. Look at a ship like the Island Sky, like I traveled on, about 100 passengers. Actually, it's the old Renaissance 5, so it carries a total of 114 passengers. So from Russian icebreakers, we go up to a 100-passenger ship. And let's not forget, we have a lot of mainstream cruise ships that are coming down and have for years come down and dropped down and done a sail-by of the Antarctic, but they don't do landings. And we'll talk about the differences in just a moment. There's other larger vessels that carry 400 or 500 people down to the Antarctic. Here's what you need to know and what you got to understand. In the Antarctic, 100 passengers are allowed off the ship at a time to go ashore. So if you're on a vessel that carries 200 people, 100 of you will be allowed. As the other 100 are coming back, the other 100 can go ashore, and you can continue to do the math. There's some rough and ready stuff there. There's some cruise ships on the bottom right. That particular image is a favorite of mine because it's the old Silver Cloud. The old Silver Cloud. I was shore excursion manager on that ship in the 90s, and the Silver Cloud is now sailing in Antarctic just like I did in December of last year. So I'm pretty darn proud that that girl is still sailing the high seas just like me. And then you've got even higher end ships here like the Scenic Eclipse. All of these are ice hulled. This one has a helicopter and a submarine. You know what's happening to the market. It's absolutely exploding. And you got to do your homework. You got to do your reading. This is one of my favorite books. I have one chapter left to read in Endurance. And if there's anything that this book taught me, it taught me that if Shackleton and his team can get through what they did, we can all get through what's happening to us right now. When I look at that map to the Antarctic to the right and the Weddell Sea, the Bellingshausen Sea, and I see what explorers have gone through in the past to get here, we know that there's a thirst to travel and explore. Read books by Sarah Wheeler. She's got some great stories. And my personal favorite was John Harrison. And this one was Forgotten Footprints because it wasn't terribly complicated and it was fairly easy to read. And it was little snippets of all of these explorers who came from around the world. And names will start meaning something to you, like Bellingshausen, like Amundsen, like Palmer. And it's not just going to be the big guys that you know about. It's going to be a lot of the smaller ones that you'll discover because the whole exploration of this part of the world is really, really new. But this trip that I did in December was not my first trip to the Antarctic. In fact, this was my first trip to the Antarctic when I ran shore excursions and was the shore excursion manager on board the Silver Cloud. Passengers on my ship paid me quite a bit of money, and we chartered this 737 from National Airlines, and we catered it from the ship with our food, with our champagne, with our crew. And we would fly from the airport from Punta Arenas, the same airport that they're using today to fly down on the charters and drop people off there. And what we would do is board this plane. Everybody would be fed and watered. We would fly over the Antarctic, tilt our wings to look at the ice shelf. Remember, the season here is late November, December, January, February. And then we would sail back to, or I should say, fly back to Punta Arenas. One great story that happened out of this, one of our great crew members, his name was Carlos. He was from Spain. Wonderful, delightful guy. Our crew were serving on board. The aircraft crew were only there to support, so we were serving the champagne and all of the food. Carlos was so nervous about flying that he went back into the loo to have a cigarette to calm his nerves, which promptly then set off all the alarms in the whole aircraft. And yes, you can imagine. So we were a very tight-knit group by the time we landed back in Punta Arenas. The second time I went to the Antarctic was on what I call a drive-by. My husband was the expedition lead on an Oceania ship, and we went from Ushuaia, dropped down, although we did no landings. But this ship in this image you're looking at in front of you is a fake. That is not a ship in the Antarctic. You know why? There's green. Any image you see with green in it better be a lichen, or that picture is not from the Antarctic, because nothing lives down there, my friends. So although this is a picture of a ship up in Alaska, there are opportunities to do drive-bys, and those are wonderful experiences, but entirely different. This is what I wanted to do. I wanted to see it. I wanted to smell it. I wanted to taste it. I wanted to feel it. The problem I had is that Maureen had put it into my heart that this is what I needed to do, so I needed to make it happen. And the reason why we have 100 people at a time is because we got to preserve what we've got here in Mother Nature, kind of like a lot of countries will only allow a certain amount of people in, like Galapagos with their licensing. It's the same thing here in the Antarctic, where this year there was just over 53,000 people, but you'll be a little bit stunned by the numbers later on. But this is how I wanted to do the Antarctic. I wanted to do the landing, so I knew I needed to be on a ship with less than 100 people. Eat it, drink it, smell it, sleep it, and taste it. My husband had spent some time at the McMurdo base down in Antarctica, so he had put it into my heart to be able to do this a long time ago, and I was going to hit this seventh continent by the end of last year. And this is what I picked. I flew to Ushuaia. I spent 2 nights in Ushuaia, got on a ship there called the Island Sky. We had about 2 days at sea, about a day and a half. I'll share that journey with you. As we zipped down and made our way, this is plan A, B, C, D, and E, and that would be just during the morning time when you get down here, through the Shetland Islands on to the continent of the Antarctic. And what you see on the right-hand side is the actual chart and the proper navigation of what we actually did on our trip. Some of you may have been to Ushuaia. It's called Fin del Mundo on Tierra del Fuego, which is an island in the southern end. Tierra, land, fuego, fire. Stunningly, stunningly beautiful place. Lots of people came in here early. Wonderful spas and hiking and kayaking. Biking as well was a big thing here. Really surprised at how many folks came in early to take advantage of it. But what you see here is what you get. That's the pier. When I sailed into here in the 1990s, that pier looked exactly the same. The security was amazing on this pier. Every ship going in and out of the Antarctic will go out of Ushuaia. That's where we got all of our provisioning from. So when you start wondering why it's so expensive to go to the Antarctic, you're probably looking about $1,000 a day to do it. Remember, you've still got some Russian icebreakers. You've got some ships that are pretty high end, everything in the middle. Remember, everything's coming out of here. Your food, your fuel, your flights, your provisions, your crew, everything, all the laundry, everything you need for a week. And Ushuaia is so much fun. The hotels were reasonable. The people were great. The excitement's building because everybody's there. And everybody's pretty much got something to do with the Antarctic there. And there's a tremendous amount of king crab. And that king crab there, I think, was about $30. And I love that ring on my left finger. I'll share something with you a little bit later on, but that was a piece of jewelry I managed to buy in Africa last year. That was a little bit of a rite of passage. Don't mistake how far away from civilization you are here in Fin del Mundo. Someone once said to me, oh, it's so expensive to go to the Antarctic. It's really not. That's just what it costs. Look how far away you are from Buenos Aires or Iguazu Falls or Mendoza. In the middle, the red is all the bases that exist there. Remember, nobody lives here, just the military bases, or let me retract the word military. Those are country bases for scientific purposes. And you're still 1,000 kilometers away from anything. And look at that, just to get to Rio, over 4,000 kilometers. So yeah, you're a really, really long way to get to a lot of the spots, which makes things challenging. So coming out of Ushuaia is a really humbling experience. The weather was exquisite the day that I'd left. The weather changes. This was right in December, I think December 13th or 14th. I flew in through Buenos Aires, changed airport, something you should be aware of. There is the main airport at BUE and another airport called AEP, which is the domestic terminal. My friends, that's why you use travel professionals. They'll never let you screw up. And it took over 3 hours just to get through customs to arrive into the country. So we sailed out in the evening time about 5 o'clock. We were in the passage, very protected, until about midnight. And then we popped out onto what is very fondly known as the Drake Lake or the Drake Passage. And well, in our case, it was the Drake Lake. This was our day at sea. We were on the deck with binoculars. That was Michael. He was our geologist from Canada. I had no idea I could go running to the side of a ship with a pair of binoculars and get so excited about looking at petrels and snow petrels and skuas. Suddenly, these exquisite birds, you're in the middle of nowhere, and they pick up the draft from the back of your ship, and you're sipping a cup of coffee and watching these guys. and they're with you for hours and hours. And we're going further and further south. It's December. The days are incredibly long. The bridge is an open bridge policy, and that's something really special. And that's Charlie. He's always going to hold a real special place. He taught me so much about navigation and barometric pressure and the directions we were going in. And the guy was a heck of a singer. We were out here over Christmas. These guys put on a heck of a show. But I got to say, it was really, well, like everything in life, it's almost always about the people, isn't it? But this was Ash, and I'll show you a picture of Ashley later. I never saw anyone who could get excited about birds as much as Ash could. There were 13 expedition leaders on our vessel with polar latitudes. She was just one of them, talking to us about the convergence, about that water coming together when the cold Antarctic water comes northbound. And it meets that warm, tepid, well, you can't use the word tepid, but that warm water coming southbound. And suddenly you've got a buffet of fish. This is why it's such a difference when you get down into the Antarctica, why the water is so nutrient rich. But we were really lucky. We had this on the Drake Passage. And I have to say, of the 2 times I've been down here, this has pretty much been the journey. So it has been a real blessing. But y'all, it's amazing. Mother Nature never ceases to amaze. It's the smallest things in the ocean that feed the largest of the critters. And it was through our expedition leaders, through our assistant expedition leader, and that was Steffi and Ash, some Canadians, some Argentinians. We had glaciologists and ornithologists. We had people who could tell us what we were seeing, who could tell us about Mother Nature, about the birds, about the cetaceans, which I quickly discovered means whales, which was a very kind of exciting word to use, like, ooh, cetaceans. So here's some stats, some really interesting things. We'll make these available for you. I'll put these up on my Facebook page, but 5.5 million square miles, 10% of the land's Earth's surface covers this. In austral winter, which would be the summer that we have here in North America, the place doubles its size. Can you imagine a mean depth of ice, meaning an average depth of ice of over 1 mile in length, 1 mile in depth? On December 21st, the day that I was there, the sun barely kissed the horizon and then just popped back up out to the other side. And there are 78 million penguins, it is said, to be found here. And in 1961, with the signature of the Antarctic Treaty, no country has claims to the Antarctic continent, and it can be used for scientific purposes. I found this Antarctic, this picture of this airmail stamp, which is really kind of a neat thing. However, leave it to some folks. In 2007, I found it interesting. Russia, leave it to them, pushed the boundaries and used a helicopter to try to lay some territorial boundaries. They were stopped. They did the same thing in the Arctic, so it's not really surprising. And much to my surprise, in 2004, Australia pushed the boundaries a little bit, trying to say that the Antarctic was part of their, quote, continental shelf. Which then starts getting into, 3-mile radiuses and who really owns the oceans and the seas. So go Russia, go Australia, try to push those boundaries. But this is what we did. We did landings in Yankee Harbor and Triangle Point, Fournier Bay, Orne Harbor, Useful Island, Danco, Georges, and Patagonia. This was exactly the itinerary that we did. Every day was just filled with joy, with experiences. All of our expedition leaders were the ones who were driving the Zodiacs. They were taking us out every day. The safety, the security was always the really big thing, but you really figured out quick that this was a tight team. These images were taken on South Shetland. Take a look at the ground. You see a little bit of greenery in the background. That's how we know we're not on the continent. You start to see the rocks and you see the penguins. Love this photograph of the penguins themselves. Very often you would just drop into the snow or down to a piece of rock. But we were here on the South Shetlands, so the topography was entirely different. This is like the leftovers of a glacial moraine from the glaciers having retreated. So the topography here was almost a little bit more kind of like what you'd find up in Alaska, and very different than what we were to find on other landings coming up. This was Sarah and her husband Morris. They were from New York. I have a great photograph of them later on. He was an ophthalmologist, and they spent 6 weeks every winter going out and skiing in Vail. And this had been a dream trip for them forever. And remember, I told you in the Antarctic, there's journeys that do kayaking. There are some extreme with some of the diving and such. Kayaking is really not that out there. All of us are in dry suits there. Some companies included. In some cases, it's a little bit extra. And my friends on that left-hand side with that striped hat, that would be me. And after a while, the one thing I discovered that really was necessary in the Antarctic, because everybody starts to look the same, is you really need character with your hats so that you can start to recognize yourself. The gentleman in front of me was from Israel. He was on board with his family and his children as well. You can see one of the Hurtigruten ships in the background. And every day we did at least 2 of these activities. We kayaked, we walked on the shore, we sat, the weather changed. If we couldn't get ashore, we would zip out onto the zodiacs and go a bit further. And this particular piece is a video. And I'll see if I can get that to play for you. Some of them are working well. There we are. Not sure if you can hear it or not, but this was at one of our landings. The zodiacs will come ashore. You've always got to be in particular clothing, and I'll share with you what that clothing is. And this is what it was looking at these penguins. Wait for it. There's more to come. Where one goes, there he goes down. I can't even begin to tell you how many penguins we had a chance to see. And also so many of the Weddell seals. And Ash had a wonderful way of describing these Weddell seals. She said they're big, belching, farting blobs of blubber. And then our expedition team, these people were really extraordinary. This was Mr. Hart, Mark Hart. He was from the UK. We jokingly said this guy would throw himself into a crevasse to have a good time. One time when we were out on the Zodiac with him, we had a chance to see some bubble netting. And that's when a whale will dive underneath. They exhale their air and create a bubble netting, and that forces all the krill closer and closer and closer together. All the fish come in here, and essentially what you've got is a buffet with all of these whales coming up and having lunch. And that's what our Zodiac was radioing to the others. Whales having lunch. And these were the baleen whales here. There's 8 species of whales. 2 of them are toothed. I'll show you some killer whales later. But these were the baleen whales, and we saw them again and again and again. We saw them from the Zodiac. We saw them up close. We saw them with our photographs. We saw them as we were holding along the edge of the shore looking at ice sculptures. This ice is hundreds of thousands of years old. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around that kind of depth of oldness. I think the only time I felt that humbled was when I was in Israel, in realizing it, what I was seeing and experiencing was just so very, very unusual. The whales were incredible, the ability to get the shots on their tail, everyone getting so very excited. And as you are likely aware, when you get a shot of a whale's tail, that is like a fingerprint for a human. And we got many photographs on board our ship, close enough of the whale's tail that we loaded those up to a website called happywhale.com. If you're not familiar with it, it's something, an activity you may want to do or look at, but you can actually trace whales. And this particular whale that we found, we discovered was a new whale to science, because many of them migrate here to feed. And these are the same whales that you're going to find off of California, or you may find them later in the years up in Alaska. But the Zodiac experiences were really extraordinary. It was being able to be in the Zodiacs. Of course, you don't have any kind of Wi-Fi connection here. We did have them on board the ship, but not with everybody at the same time when we got back trying to load all of our pictures. But it was the pristineness and the sheer beauty. And I think recognizing that the things that you were eyeballing that no other human being had ever seen. Traveling with other like-minded individuals. Lori, who may even be online with us here tonight, boy, does that girl travel. She had done some extraordinary trips. We were out having lunch, and I want to bust the myth that it's just too darn cold to be outside, and that's not the case. It's just bundling up that you need to do. And another lovely piece of jewelry around my neck there, which was a gold band and my husband's wedding band, wearing that around my neck. Listen, I don't want you to think you're going to go hungry down here. Think back to all that provisioning coming into Ushuaia. These were the exact menus. And the vessel that I happen to be sailing on, for those of you in the business, will recognize the name R5. Her hull was the R5 for the old Renaissance 5. So there's a lot of ships that go on charter here. That's why it's really important to know who you're doing business with, where you're going, what kind of policies they have, what their day-by-day activities look like. And the big question here, your first question to self is, do you want to do a drive-by or do you want to do landings? And then if you want to do the landings, what do you want those to look like? A smaller ship or a larger ship, knowing that only 100 passengers can go ashore at a time. This is about environment. This is about the future of our world. We had a lot of debates and discussions about Scott and Shackleton, about whether everything we're reading in the news is really true. That statistic I gave you earlier about the amount of drinking water, 90% of the world's drinking water coming from the Antarctic. Well, is that really true? How quickly is that changing? And all of these passenger carrying vessels are also doing science while they're here. And again, busting that myth about the Antarctic being so freezing cold. This water was about 1 degree. I got a 9 on this jump, by the way, and it's not your imagination. That is a rope tied around your waist. The doctor was over to the side, and that's Charlie right there. Oh, and another lovely piece of jewelry. There was my 9. And that, my friends, is called a polar plunge. And a polar plunge is followed by a shot of something or other. On our vessel, it was tequila. But I will tell you, out of 90 people on board, 62 did the jump. Guys like my friend Christopher here, he and his mom were traveling together. They were from Virginia. That was my roommate, Abby. She was from California. I traveled single. I did a single share, so they matched me up with my dear new friend, Abby, who I absolutely loved. And there is Cynthia. She was from Houston, Texas. And 2 days before we left for this trip, she did her last chemo treatment and got clearance to come to Antarctica because she said nobody was going to stop her from going. And then there was my dear couple from New York who had been skiing 6 weeks every year and had never been in a kayak before. And the two of them jumped in the water because someone turned to them and said, when an opportunity to have an experience comes in front of you, I always think you should say yes. And they looked at each other and they went back to their cabin and they got their robes and they jumped into line and they went ahead and did the polar plunge because I don't know, I think that's what life is all about. But in our last bit here, I do want to share with you what our experiences on the Antarctic were like, hitting the continent itself. And yep, these were the trails that were created. The paths that we were walking in were initially created by penguins. And I'll show you a little bit further up. We just saw so many penguins that you kind of forgot to look at them after a while. Most ships will provide you with the poles. The walking really wasn't that difficult. It's a very neat path. And the red jacket that you see me wearing was also provided by the ship, as are the boots, which is pretty much a standard. That little guy is a chin strap penguin, and he is a little monkey. That little guy loves to steal pebbles, and we must have watched him for 20 minutes just sitting in the snow. He's covered in guano, which is a nice word for penguin poop, which smells really bad, so you wipe your boots carefully when you bring it back to the ship. But we watched these guys for hours, and it would snow for a little bit, and then it would clear, and it really wasn't that cold. It really wasn't that harsh, because after all, you walked on the 7th continent. This photograph was the day that I stood on the continent, and that is the actual continent of Antarctic, the rock. And that was my 7th continent, and a whole bunch of us got to do it that day. This was a wonderful couple. They met last year. I love this because they are holding a magazine, and it's a skydive magazine. She is a dentist. He is an IT guy. They met skydiving over Egypt in September last year and then took this trip in December. We saw enough Gen 2 chin-strapped and one Adelie penguin, and when we saw that Adelie penguin, Ash burst into tears. It was phenomenal. We were out in the water kayaking at this point, heard a huge crash in the water, and one of the icebergs actually tipped, and we had a small little wave come towards us. At first, we thought it was going to be a gigantic tidal wave, but we sort of settled and took a photograph together. I highly recommend the kayaking, but here's what a day in general is going to look like on a trip that has landings. A Zodiac cruise, snow, ice, penguins, seals, whales, they got them all. You're at sea level and you're looking up. Friends, the Antarctic is the coldest and driest place on Earth, but we are at sea level here. Certainly the air on board the ship was a little bit dry. The cold air and the temperature was so well managed, just being properly dressed. Where we were in the kayaks here, we were actually in dry suits, which were provided by the ships. Every evening was a recap and a briefing and a toast, and of course, the exchange of photographs. And what was really interesting were some of the discussions about the explorers, about the politics, about the thought about the future. The Antarctic Tour Operators Association. Are we even right being here and traveling as we do? And you may be surprised when you see the numbers a little bit later, as long as I can find them where my kitty cat's laying on top of the desk here. But yeah, this part of the world really has a tremendous amount of substance to it. And that's what really made a very, very big difference. Landings in Yankee Harbor. Sailors came here for sealing. Oh, but they didn't want to share it. They would go out and do the sealing, but give false information because you don't want everybody else coming in and killing the seals that were for you. So there was so much false information, which is why it took even longer for some of these areas to get explored, to get mapped. And a couple of the landings that we did had never even been done before, ours at Yankee Harbor. Note in front of you. Earlier, I probably should have pointed it out, but one of the photographs was actually of the chicks eating. And one of our very talented photographers was able to capture this one of the little one pooping, which they seem to spend a tremendous amount of time of, and which accounts for an awful lot of the pink stuff that's on those rocks. But those gigantic piles of burping and farting blubber, these guys are the Weddell seals. And the male Weddell seals are here on the shore right now for about 8 weeks straight. They're molting. They went out to sea, they filled their fabulous big bellies, and they rolled ashore. And until they are finished molting, they don't go back to sea. They rub against each other, they rub up on the rocks until they finish molting. So these guys are pretty cranky when you're walking along the beach, and you'll be instructed as to where you can walk and how far away you need to keep from things. And somebody's always got a camera someplace because we celebrated life all over. The little boy on the left was my kayak partner's son. They were from Israel. And the little girl on the right, her name is Naomi. My friends, take a look at that face. And I walked up to her and hugged her at the end. And I said, Naomi, I am glad to know you because you're going to be running a country someday when you grow up. And I want to be able to say I met you when you were down here in the Antarctic with us, learning about our world and what it means. This was like nothing I'd ever experienced before, the surrealness of being surrounded by silence, by land that you really got to want to get to. Sitting and watching these penguins and then seeing it through the eyes of others. I'll never forget Scout, who was actually our photographer's daughter. And when we saw the orca whales and I learned about orcas and their fins are straight up in the air because they're in the wild. And they were there with their babies, and we slowed down and we could see them and see them feeding, and they knew that we were there. And you keep that respectful distance. It's like that understanding between Mother Nature and people that if you respect, they will respect. And that's why we have treaties and organizations and why we have such extraordinary people that work in places like this to, make it all real. And maybe why people like me come back and say, I pulled a piece of ice from the Antarctic, and what's so weird is that's called black ice. even though it's as clear as can be, and it's called black ice because when you look at it in the water, it is so clear you see through it and you see all the plankton. This is just ice that's been compacted, 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 and all of the air has gone out of it. And for those of you who have gone to Alaska, into some of the fjords, you too have likely fished out a piece of that ice and had a fabulous drink in the evening time. And we played cards, and there is my Cynthia there, and I look at her, and she's just a beacon of strength. But it was the expedition leaders. It was people from all over the world, folks from Europe. They just made such a huge difference. These are people that are changing the world. And when you want to go to Antarctica and you wonder about what to bring, it really is not a complicated life. The clothing, the boots, and the jackets are provided. You see the hat there with the jacket, that's provided. The boots they give you on board, and you leave those behind. I'll show you in a little bit more, but heavyweight fleeces, dressing in layers is really the big deal. Sunglasses, it sounds like a crazy thing, but my big lesson that I learned was flat sunglasses. Ladies, these gigantic big polarized Jackie O glasses don't work down here. They need to be flat. You need to be able to pull your hat right down over your head, and you definitely need stuff that's going to have to be polarized. Dress in layers, cuddle duds, I think was the absolute best when I went ashore. Bottom layer with a top layer, a second layer on top of that. I then would put on a pair of flannels, sometimes that gray pair on top, depending on where I was going. And then the bottom right-hand side are the wet landing pants. Everyone must have those in order to go ashore. That's just a must. You can buy them for $60. I spent about $800 on gear getting ready to go to the Antarctic, but full disclosure, I live in Florida. I didn't even have a pair of closed-toed shoes or pair of socks, so I kind of had to buy the full gamut of things. But it really is all about dressing in layers. The thermaware, which is really kind of neat. You definitely need a gaiter for your neck. Several pairs of socks. The hats were ridiculously important, and you need a couple of them. And of course your gloves. It's not like your intention is to get your hands wet, but when you go ashore, you start looking like this on the left, or a landing on the right-hand side. And like I said, you need to be able to recognize yourself. So I tried a nice little kitty cat hat. Well, I was out in the kayak, but I think I looked a little bit more like Mickey Mouse at the end of the day. But I'm telling you, people make the world go round. When you look at a ship, this was our expedition team, and I see the kayak leaders and the expedition leaders and the folks who were dealing with the passenger things. Every one of them could drive a Zodiac. We had oceanographers and ornithologists and glaciologists and rock people and bird people. And these were some of the most exquisite individuals that I've ever met. And on a daily basis, we kept a list of what we were going to see. That was my exact list, photograph of it there. And some final thoughts. Portable humidifier was a really big deal. $20 on Amazon will take you a really long way. Whole bunch of little things to keep your lips dry. The place is really, really dry, so those moists are really important. Hand warmers are fabulous. Put them in your hands, you put them down your top, into your back, into your boots. Those were the bomb. And you're likely going to get into penguin or pandemonia, if you will. I really got into doing things like making penguin cookies. I did make some polar bears as well, but of course, polar bears are found in the Arctic, not found in the Antarctic. But of course, the Arctic, polar bears gave the Arctic their name. Arctos is the Greek word for bear. So when you think of the Arctic, think of a polar bear, Arctos. So the Antarctic, Anti-Arctos, has no polar bears. So that's why we have a whole bunch of penguins. And if you think about going there, you're stuck at home now, try making some penguin cookies. That was my little rookery last week. Seriously, it was just white icing, black icing, and some cookies. And it's only the third time in my life that I'd ever made cookies and had that little cutter. And it was really, really a fun thing. The Antarctic is really an exquisite place, and life is really about, I think, what we create at the end of the day. I want to show you some numbers here if I can get to my screen. The Antarctic Tour Operators Association tells us during the 2018 to 2019 season, which is the season I went. I went in December 2019. 55,489 people went to the Antarctic. So I was one of 55,489 people. Isn't that phenomenal? But if you go back in time to 1985, that number was 800. In 2004, that number was 10,000. So since 2004, 10,000 travelers, and now 55,489. That's why we have a limit of 100 people going ashore. That's why ships larger than whether it's 400 or 500, there was some debate going on, or even allowed to disembark passengers there. That's why rules and regulations are getting tighter, and that's why they should be, because this is the environment that we're protecting. This is what we're doing. And so if you're home and you want to get a little more connected to the Antarctic, watch a film. Watch Happy Feet. It's a blast. Ladies, for those of you out there, Where'd You Go, Bernadette? That opening scene when Kate Blanchett is seen there and she's in a kayak in the Antarctic, take out Kate Blanchett's face and put yours in there, because that could be you. That's what drove me to make the commitment to go to the Antarctic. Make some penguin cookies or even some marshmallow polar bears. Try a book. Endurance was one of my favorites. And after all, we are enduring a whole lot right now. But the endurance book is actually an easier read than you think if you take it in little bites. And it is extraordinary what man is really able to do. Look up happywhale.com. Follow whales. Who knows? Something you may be able to do. And there's also citizen science. That was something. Remember, a lot of these vessels that go down into the Antarctic are doing science projects. They are doing science on behalf of NOAA, on behalf of some of the oceanographic institutes throughout the world. Those are really neat things to be able to go ahead and take a look at. My trip in total was 14 days from door to door. I left Tampa, flew to Miami, Miami to Buenos Aires to Ushuaia, 2 nights in Ushuaia, and then I had what I would say was 9 sleeps on board. We came back to Ushuaia, and then I sort of began the long journey back, and I got back in and around December 30th, which was really interesting because 2 days after I came back, Travel Weekly put out the top page. Their first article was that Antarctica was now the #1 place to go. And I thought, yeah, there we go. Nailed it. Already got there. Here we go. My friends, tomorrow night, same time, same link. I don't know what we're going to talk about. I found some more information and more deeper knowledge on the Antarctic, some things about the Panama Canal, possibly some things in Russia. Don't know if you've ever heard of a gentleman by the name of Sir Hubert Wilkins, who was an Australian explorer, but I have a pretty deep love of exploration, funny things like the Panama Canal, the lost continent of Atlantis. So we'll see if I can find us something interesting to catch up with for tomorrow night. Thanks to all of you for joining me. Happy travels to all of you. Let us remember one thing, and that is to travel is to live. And that's exactly what we're going to continue to do again and again and again. Follow me on my Facebook page, and I'll look forward to catching up with all of you again. Happy evening.